back of the Hondo. At this time, please silence your cell phones. Thank you. Is that better? What? Yeah, it's get a better mic.
So is it all totally confusing?
I don't know.
You see like the ministers that should be sort of saying try to find out the the song of
Yes, that's right.
So he needs to say his opening remarks.
Yeah.
And the contra person's right?
Yes.
Shit. Good morning. Good morning. Thank you, Emily. My name is Soma, Way Music Service. Music for today's service is arranged for us under the direction and coordination of Kemi Nakabayashi. The chanting and musical selections for today are found in Seattle Tacoma's new Gotha book, which we are using for the first time today. Today's selections were chosen in gratitude for our precious earth. Please refer to your written program for page numbers and order of service. We will begin service now with the ringing of the kancho, followed directly by chanting of the Vandana Tisarana found on page 147 and Jusege found on page 14. Vandana and Tisarana, yeah, okay, they're found. You know where they're found. And the Jusege will be immediately followed by Ondoku-san to the Japanese verse only found on page 107. So the Vandana Tisarana again is found on page 147, followed by the Jusege, which is found on page 14, and then Ondoku-san 2, the Japanese verse only, found on page 107. Thank you. Please rise for the singing of How Sweetly the Lotus Grows, found on page 67 of your new Gotha book. Thank you. Please default refuge led by Don Castro, who will also be a speaker. Did you catch that? I've been told that the threefold refuge is on the program.
Threefold refuge. Difficult is it to receive a human form. Now we are living it. Difficult is it to hear the Dharma of the Buddha. Now we hear it. If we do not cross over to the truth, in what life shall we cross over? Let us, with sincerity and true reverence, take refuge in the three treasures of the truth. I take refuge in the Buddha. May we, together with all sentient beings, awaken to the great way of enlightenment and to the surpassed intent of a Buddha. I take refuge in the Dharma. May we, together with all enter the storehouse of the Dharma, becoming like the wisdom ocean. I take refuge in the Sangha. We, together with all sentient beings, become units in true accord, in harmony with all things. The peerless, profound, and wondrous Dharma is rare to encounter, even in many hundreds and thousands of kalpas. Now we are privileged to hear and receive it. Let us thoroughly understand the true meaning of the Tathagata's teaching. Namo Amida Vitsa Namanda, Namanda Vitsa Namanda, Namanda Vitsa Namanda. Maybe many of you heard on the radio this morning that there was a bombing in Sri Lanka, and over 200 people were killed and quite a number were injured, and we don't have many details about it. I was listening to NPR, and they were still trying to figure out, the nature of the bombing, but let's take a minute in silence to think about, to send out loving and caring thoughts to those who have lost loved ones in Sri Lanka this morning. So I'll ring the bell. Please join me in Gash. And when we ring it again, then we'll conclude. Namanda, 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 I'd like to introduce today's speaker. We've been trying to get him to Seattle for the longest time, and he came for our Earth Day yesterday, which many of you were at, and sorry, I just feel like I should burst out and just talk, and my normal ministers could hear me without a microphone, but okay. Years ago, many years ago, Reverend Dr. Duncan Ryuken Williams showed up uninvited at our Dharma exchange and gave the most wonderful talk. He was visiting Tetsukashima. So that was the first time, maybe the first time I had ever seen him. I thought, wow, this extraordinary person. And he's one of the people who has really, people who are bicultural, bilingual, and really take advantage of that. And he's that type of rare person. In the United States, when he was 17, he grew up in Japan and England until age 17. So his first language is Japanese, but his other first language is English, because he's so thoroughly bilingual. As I've heard him say, also bicultural, at least bicultural. So he came to the United States to attend Reed College and graduate school at Harvard University, where he received his doctorate degree in religion. He is currently professor of religion and East Asian languages and cultures and the director of the University of Southern California Shinso Ito Center for Japanese Religions and Culture. Previously, he held the Shinjo Ito Distinguished Chair of Japanese Buddhism at the University of California, and served as the director of the Center for Japanese Studies for 4 years. So he was just down the road from our Center for Buddhist Education, our Jodo Shinshu Center in Berkeley, and they invited him often. He had a good relationship there. He has also been ordained since 1993 as a Buddhist priest in the Soto Zen tradition and served as the Buddhist chaplain at Harvard University from 1994 to 1996. He is the co-editor of Buddhism and Ecology, the reason we invited him yesterday, The Interconnectedness of Dharma and Deeds, and the author of the recently published American Sutra, A Story of Faith and Freedom in the Second World War. And so it's the incarceration of Japanese Americans during World War II from a Buddhist perspective, which is really very, very interesting. And he's been traveling constantly in a book promotion tour. So I'm just amazed that he was able to carve out time to come here and to speak about another subject, Buddhism and ecology, but also today, those of you who bought his book at convention will have it and have read it, or even if you haven't read it, you'll have a chance to talk with him and ask him questions at 12 o'clock today in the Hondo. He will be here to have a Q&A. So we're just delighted to have Duncan Williams, Reverend Dr. Duncan Williams as our guest speaker for our Earth Day service today.
Good morning, everybody. So I think yesterday I had a full hour to talk, and I think I have like 15 minutes today. So I'm going to see if I can say something worthy in that time. And because it's Earth Day, I try to pick something short that I could focus on to see if I could share something worthwhile about the Dharma. And so I picked a text that's 4 lines long from my tradition of Buddhism, Soto Zen Buddhism. It's founded by a Zen Buddhist teacher called Dogen, lived from 1200 to 1253 in Japan. And he wrote a text called the Shobo Genzo, and it's from there. So let me read the 4 lines, and I'll try to explain it a little bit and see if we can connect it to some of the themes that are appropriate for today. So here are the 4 lines. The first line says, to study the Buddha way, or in other words, to study Buddhism, to study the Buddha way is to study the self. Then the next line, to study the self is to forget the self. Then the third line says, to forget the self is to be actualized by the 10,000 things. And in classical Japanese or Chinese literature, 10,000 things means like everything on earth, everything. And the next line says, when actualized by the 10,000 things, your body and mind, as well as the body and mind of others, drop away, and no trace of enlightenment remains. And this no trace continues endlessly. So I want to parse out a little bit those 4 sentences from a text. So it's the first one, to study the Buddha way is to study the self. For me, as Reverend Castro just mentioned, I was born in Tokyo, Japan, and my mom's Japanese, and my dad's British. And I think many of us who grow up like with one parent from one culture, another parent from another culture, like at some point you're kind of like really, like am I Japanese, am I British? My dad was British, so we also went to the Anglican church in Tokyo, St. Albans Church, and my mom was devout Buddhist family, so we went to temple, and I was like, am I Christian? Am I like what? Who am I? I think became this question, and I think everybody around their teenage years or going to late, early 20s, you start to think about who am I? What's my purpose? All of that kind of thing. And so the good news for me was that it said, to study the Buddha way is to study the self. So, okay, I'm trying to figure out who I am, and that's actually Buddhism. That's actually the study of Buddhism, is to figure out what makes me, right? So when I was, as Reverend Castro said, I started investigating this in my teen years, and I went to Reed College, and I lived at a Buddhist temple for a year, and then I finally decided to consider becoming a Buddhist priest. And back in Japan, I knew somebody who would ultimately become my ordination teacher. And I'd go to him every year saying, in pursuing path, more deeply, and become a Buddhist priest. And he'd always be like, you are stupid, or you don't know what you're talking about, or like, and then 1993, like one year, he said, you know what, do you even know what it means to be a Buddhist priest? And I said, no, because I knew this was like a Zen question. So it's like, you have to always answer those, I don't know. Then you put the ball in their court, and he's like, when you become a Zen priest, you will have no more holidays. So that seemed a little bit odd thing for him to say. But what he meant was that when you put your robes on, or when you become something called a Buddhist priest, you can't say, this is my time, and this is my, like, and you know, like, everywhere, at least in Japan, when people are on holiday, like during Obon period in the summer or during the end of the year, that's the busiest time for the Buddhist temple. And if you're a Buddhist priest and somebody in your temple member family has a problem, you can't just say, like, don't talk to me now because it's my, you know. So it's like you have to devote yourself. And so he was like, are you still interested in becoming a Buddhist priest? I'm interested. And then that's when he said, well then, in that case, you have to make every day a holiday. So that was interesting. So I'm going to come back to that in a moment. But that first thought where he was like, you know, if you want to study your Buddhism, you have to figure out who you are, and you have to kind of figure out yourself, and you also have to let go of this idea of the self. And he would tell me things like, you know, you might be Buddhist, or you might be have some background in Christianity, some background, but the Buddhist path is a middle path, and you're going to find yourself in that in-between space, in between categories and constructs that people have created, and you're going to have to find that in-between path, and that's where you're going to discover something interesting. So as I started to do that, that second line of what I read, so the first line I remember was, to study this, the Buddha way is to study the self. So you start investigating, who am I, who am I, who am I? And the second line says, to study the self is to forget the self. Wasuru in the Japanese. But it means, I think, to let go of one's preconceptions of who you are. That's the only time you can really see your authentic self. And go into that in-between place to see really who you are. To see who you are, not just how you imagine it, how you want to be seen by your own self, but how you really are. And if you investigate yourself, I think we all know, like, there's some amazing things about talented things, you know, but also like crappy things about art, you know. You look at yourself and you're like, oh, I've got these weaknesses. I've got to be able to fully embrace that. That's the first time when you can let go of any preconception of the self. And I think that's what it means to forget the self, to let go of the self, to let go of any preconceptions. And then the next line says, to forget the self is to be actualized by the 10,000 things. And I said 10,000 things means everything on the earth. And because it's Earth Day, I thought it was a helpful line. That's to say that we are made up. When we let go of any preconceptions, what we see is that ourselves is nothing other than the interconnected relationship with everything. Everything, right? And so we wouldn't exist as a self if we didn't have parents who didn't have their parents. We wouldn't exist in our present moment if, you know, even if you're vegetarian, you still have to eat, right? So you're taking other life into you, and you're composed of, made of food and water. Like clouds need to exist for there to be like water, right? And the water needs to exist for there to be plant. Like everything is interconnected. And there's that vision in Buddhism of the Indra. I don't know how many of you have heard of that, but it's this idea that the world was created by the god Indra in such a way that he cast a web, a net, that extends infinitely in every direction. And it's like if you can imagine like a tennis court net. You know, in tennis court, these little knots, and like in each knot there would be like a jewel. And in each jewel, it's cut like a diamond, right? So it's something like it looks like a mirror. And if you look at one jewel, the idea in this is that you can see all of the other jewels in this net. That in one thing, in one self, you can find everything. And because this net extends infinitely, all of the other jewels also reflect each other. All right? So that's, I think, one of the key insights of Buddhism, is that we're not alone. We're interconnected through time and through space with everything. And to me, that's a very ecological vision. And so that's how I interpret, when you forget the self, you're actualized by the 10,000 things. And then it says, when you're actualized by the 10,000 things, means when you really see that yourself is just interconnected with everything, that's when the body and mind of others drop away and remains, and this no trace continues endlessly. Which means that there's no beginning, there's no end, and we're just part of some very interconnected web of life. And when we just acknowledge that, you know, that we don't need to gain anything, we don't need to, that is also related to the Buddhist goals of awakening, and that awakening is not really about gaining something, but it's about letting something go. So I wanted to end with this comment that my teacher made, that, you know, when you become a Buddhist priest, you will have no more holidays. But if you're going to accept that premise, then every day becomes a holiday. The point I want to make is that we have once a year something called Earth Day that reminds us that we are interconnected with everything. And that when we really see our interconnectedness, we know we have to, our ethics demand that we also take care of everything in that net. And that sometimes you can take care of yourself as a way of taking care of that net. And other times you need to reach out and take care of that net so that you can take care, like the self and others, it's all interconnected. And I want to leave you with this story or metaphor from the same Zen Buddhist teacher, Dogen. He wrote a book that he called it Instructions to the Cook, Tenzo Kyokun. And in his monastery, in the Buddhist temple, the cook was a really important role. And he wrote this kind of like guidance or instructions for how to be a good Buddhist cook. And he said, you know, the basic principle is you can't waste anything. Like sometimes I think if you've been in the temple, you've heard the word mottainai, waste something, you know. And anyway, so in this text, he gives guidance and basically says, to be a good Zen cook or Buddhist cook, you need to do two things. First, you need to understand what's inside the kitchen cupboards and what's inside the kitchen, the ingredients. And then you need, step two is you need to take whatever ingredients you have and you make some kind of great meal out of it. Not for your own, you know, benefit, but for the benefit of everybody else inside the temple. And not just for their material or physical well-being, but for their spiritual well-being. And so if we take that as a metaphor, okay, as the monastery or the temple, what's instructing is that we take a moment to look inside ourselves. Our ingredients are. That basic question I asked at the beginning, to study the Buddha way is to study the self. The first thing is to put up a mirror to yourself and say, who am I? What are my ingredients? And are some of the ingredients, you know, rotting cabbage, like things that are not that great? the first step is to acknowledge that, right? Acknowledge who we are exactly as we are. That's step one. But then the great trick of cooking a great meal, in other words, there's this idea like, you know, if you have great ingredients, anybody can cook a pretty decent meal. But a Buddhist cook is somebody who takes even not so good ingredients and still is able to cook something amazing for other people, for the sake of all beings, right? So that's step two, is we look at ourselves and we do something to help the world, help alleviate suffering in the world. And so that's kind of the message I wanted to leave with you today, that in our life, we have an opportunity to investigate ourselves carefully. And when we do that, we naturally find different ways to put whatever ingredients we have in our life, offering to the world, to make it a little bit less a place full of anger or delusion, but a place that's full of compassion. And so, step one, we take that mirror, discover something about ourselves. We call that wisdom in Buddhism. And then step two, find whatever is inside ourselves and offer it to the world. It's called compassion. And so in the classical tradition, they say to actually live a Buddhist life, and one that also takes into account the earth, all 10,000 things, it means that we have to be like a bird with one wing that's wisdom and the other wing that's compassion. And we can't just have wisdom or just have compassion, but we need both to fly, because you need two wings to fly. And so if you want to fly to freedom, you want to find something deep about Buddhism, the suggestion that this particular monk makes, Dogen, is that we discover something about ourselves, wisdom, and we also find some way to offer something to the world, compassion, and take those two things, and that's how we fly into the air. That's how we find liberation and awakening. So let me leave you with that as the Dharma message for today. Thank you.
Thank you, Reverend Dr. Williams. Please stand and join together in singing of Golden Chain found in your new author book on page 54. Directly with Precious found on page 111. Again, 54 and 111. Seated. Our music director, Kemi Nakabayashi, would like to say a few words.
Good morning. I'm going to make some acknowledgments, and partly what you have printed in the program is a very brief version of the introduction and acknowledgments in the New Gospel book on page numeral 8. Betsu and Ukulele Band, Tommy Cooney. Today we have Sat, Gail, Dolly, Marlene, and Greg and Tony play the Lotus Grows, and it was my request to them for today. It's important to me, and I believe to Reverend Castro, that we included one of Linda Castro's Gathas today. The original goal for the Seattle Tacoma Gatha Book project was to republish Linda Castro's music, as well as the Gathas previously published by Tacoma Buddhist Temple in a little service book of 2010 and show around the world. So this book includes most of those Tacoma Gathas as well, including their English translations. We also were able to work over 5 years with Hawaii Music Committee to have permission to include some of their English lyrics in other Japanese Gathas. And I'm grateful to Rinban Kusunoki because we got stuck a bit along the way with copyright and permission issues, and he was able to connect with Reverend Fukumoto at the Honganji, our mother temple in Kyoto, in order to include basically my wish list that Ellen Hoshino said, go for your wish list, Kemi. And my wish list was also to include the music service sutras. So thanks, Okage Samade, to all of these people. We have this book. I'd also especially like to acknowledge our Sangha singers. They're not in the program either. We have our youth instrumentalists who back, and Jared Nakashima is going to play piano for you for the Sangha gathering at the end. We have Nami Paul, Irene, Keiko, and Lorraine, and Lee. For 5 years. Also had a number of the people listed on your program helping out as proofreaders for this book. And last but not least, Yoko Yanari for helping coordinate with our printer and for her graphic art. So thank you very much, everyone.
Half of the religious community, I'd like with a small of the last 5 years. So thank you very much. Here's a little, it's a flower in soil. So we want, it should keep growing, but it's not quite as difficult as a bougainvillea, and it's not a lotus, but I hope you enjoy it for many years to come.
Where am I? Where am I? Great. Please join me in Joshua for the reading of the essential teachings of Jodo Shinshu. That's what I'm doing. Okay. Having entrusted ourselves to the teaching of Namo Amida Butsu, since the joy of having received the assurance of Ben, we shall strive to live in service to the community and humanity. Namo Amida Butsu. 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 Thank you to all musicians who contributed their talent in full musical service. The Sangha singers, Paul Mori, Bodhi Ensemble, Steve Yamasaki, Seattle Betsuin Ukulele Band, and to you, the Sangha, for participating. A special thank you to coordinating the music, not only for the author book. Thank you, Kemi. This concludes our online